Welcome to the 6th class on David. Let's start with a quick review. Last time we explored David's life and how it was shaped by sanctuaries, places we approach either with reverence for God or to use to advance our own agendas. How many of you spent time outdoors in the wilderness? The mountains, desert, ocean, maybe the Grand Canyon or Yosemite or Yellowstone? Did you experience that your perceptions were sharpened? Were you able to see more, to hear more, to smell more, to believe more? A wilderness is considered a place of spirituality in many faith traditions. Little noise, few people, animals trying to avoid humans. The solitude allows you to become aware of the circle of life. There's a sense of holiness, a sense of the sacred. Wilderness is essential in many ways. We can recognize with the First Nations people that there's a spirituality in weather and land and seasons. Here in the Western world, we've paved over millions of acres. Yet something in us longs for the wilderness. We need access to mountains and rivers, plains, lakes, deserts, things that aren't used for anything, they just are. There are some things that can only be experienced in solitude and silence, parts of being human only understood at the top of a mountain or at the edge of the seashore. In the wilderness, we aren't in control, have no assignments, no appointments. We feel our lives simplifying. We're less hurried and more spontaneous. The wilderness is attractive. But the wilderness is also frightening. It is dangerous and unpredictable. There are unexpected storms and floods, animal attacks, dangerous undertows, unexpected river currents. We come face to face with the basics in the wilderness. Stay alert, stay alive. That's why survival courses like Outward Bound can help teens and adults who are struggling with life. In the wilderness, we come face to face with ourselves and with God. And we have to answer the question, do we grow up or do we regress? Do we become more or less of the people we're called to be? David didn't start in the wilderness, and he didn't end there, but he did spend significant years there. Everyone, at least if you're dealing with God, spends time in the wilderness. David was chased there. Maybe we find ourselves there because of our own actions. David found the wilderness a place of truth, a place of beauty. Let's look at the stories of David in the wilderness and ask how David responded to God and see what we can learn for ourselves today. There are 15 stories of David in the wilderness because Saul is still trying to kill David. The first one I'd like to explore with you today is found in 1 Samuel chapter 24. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. Anyone who says the biblical writers only present their characters in the best light haven't really read the Bible. Saul is chasing after David to kill him, but normal body functions cannot be ignored, even when you're king. The men said, This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give you your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Seems like a perfect opportunity to solve all of David's problems, doesn't it? His men certainly think so. But David faced a conundrum. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave. Even though God had abandoned Saul as king, Saul is still the king, still the person God anointed as his servant to lead the Israelites. David took that very seriously and didn't ignore that fact just because it was convenient for him. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, My lord the king. When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life." Now, David could have chosen to be coarse and vulgar. "Oh, see Saul sitting on his throne," humiliating Saul in the eyes of all of his men. Instead, David decided to revere life. David saw Saul not as the enemy, but as the flawed king of Yahweh, of God. A similar thing happens later in chapter 26 when David infiltrates Saul's camp and comes upon Saul sleeping, with his army asleep beside him, failing to protect the king. David's general Abishai wants to strike Saul down with a single blow, but David stays his hand. But David said to Abishai, "Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed." So David took the spear and water jug near Saul's head, and they left. David saw Saul as God's anointed king. He knew God intended to remove Saul from the throne, but he didn't assume that he was meant to be the one to do it. Now, this presents a challenge for us today. We have to live with this tension of the responsibility to take action and the responsibility to leave things to God. We must approach these situations with great humility and wisdom to discern what God is calling us to do. Even if it wasn't David's job to remove Saul, David wasn't naive or foolish either. He didn't return to Saul's court when Saul asked him to. Then Saul said, "I have sinned. Come back, David, my son. Because you considered my life precious today, I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool and have been terribly wrong." "Here is the king's spear," David answered. "Let one of your young men come over and get it." Then Saul said to David, "May you be blessed, David, my son. You will do great things and surely triumph." So David went on his way, and Saul returned home. Spending time in the wilderness, in solitude and silence, David learned to be reverent. He developed a sense of the sacred, God's holiness, his beauty, his presence, and especially God's presence in other people. David learned to see God's glory where everyone else couldn't, to see beauty everywhere, to see the preciousness of life, to see God in places he never expected or looked before. Because of this, cheap revenge became impossible. David was trained to be devoted to God's way. He lived aware of God's presence in every person, so he couldn't treat another human with scorn or contempt. That's the surprise in spirituality. We rarely start with God. Instead, we start with a messy house, crabby kids, an impossible job. Occasionally, it starts with a smile, a beautiful sunrise, the unexpected kindness of a stranger. The surprise is that both the mess and the beauty can lead us to God. David discovered holiness, sacredness in the wilderness, and it taught him to see holiness even in an enemy. David also discovered the wilderness can be a place of refuge. David started out running for his life, but at some point, his time in the wilderness taught him the refuge he was running towards was God, his only true refuge. The metaphor of the wilderness is used quite often in the Psalms. The image of refuge in the wilderness becomes ultimately a decision to follow Yahweh, to follow God, over and above anything and anyone else. Psalm 57 is traditionally associated with this episode of David cutting the corner of Saul's robe in the cave. In this psalm, we get an overwhelming sense of God as refuge, and then of David responding in praise and worship. "Have mercy on me, my God, have mercy on me, for in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed. I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the peoples. For great is your love, reaching to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies." Saul didn't define or dominate the wilderness because David found the wilderness was full of God and not of Saul. Notice, both Saul and David find themselves in the wilderness. Saul's life narrowed to his obsession with killing David. David's life expanded because he was running to God and finding refuge, where he prayed, took in the beauty, wonder, and glory of the world, awake to God's love in His presence. We can't be naive about the wilderness because it can be dangerous and we can get hurt there. But we recognize it's also a wonderful place where you'll find God is your refuge. Important takeaways from today. If we follow God, we will find ourselves in the wilderness at some point. The wilderness is dangerous because we can get hurt there. The wilderness is also a place of beauty, truth, and refuge in God. I'd encourage you to check out the discussion guide, which also includes study suggestions and other activities. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep the faith.